In the 1950s, Hungary was a complete duality. Their football was meticulously packaged behind the Iron Curtain and was dispatched spectacularly around the world, wowing European audiences at the Olympic Games, the FIFA World Cup, and at Wembley as well as in South America on tours. Yet the beautiful football of Ferenc Puskas, Sandor Kocsis and Zoltan Czibor hid a very ugly truth back home. As Puskas dazzled the world with a brilliant dragback at Wembley, the Stalinist regime back home killed more of its own people than any Soviet satellite state. As Sandor Kocsis top-scored and lit up the 1954 FIFA World Cup, the Hungarian Revolution was brewing back on the streets of Budapest. And as Nandor Hidegkuti revolutionised the sport of football in his false nine position, Hungary crumbled under the brutal Soviet rule. Pertinent as it has been for a while, football is one of the greatest escapes the world has to offer. For Hungary in the 1950s, that has perhaps rung truer than in any other nation, in any other period in history. They boasted some of the best players in world football, a talented, well-educated crop of coaches, and delivered space-age digital football of incisive, fluid attacking movements in a weathered, analogue world. They won Olympic gold at the Helsinki Games in 1952, and 2 years later reached their second World Cup final. How did they get there? How did it all come to a gruesome end? Today we find out. It all started when a sub-tribe of the Onagurs called the Magyars headed west, found in modern-day Hungary. They called it Magyarland. Through bouts of Turkish and Austrian rule and a compromising empire of Austro-Hungary, two towns either side of the River Danube in Buda and Pest were congealed to create the modern-day capital of Hungary in 1873. In the same decade, the football arrived in Hungary thanks to returning students from Britain, and by October 1897, the first official match took place between Budapest Torna Club and Vienna Cricket and Football Club. Dozens of clubs were soon formed, a Budapest League followed, and soon the country attracted tours from England. Southampton in 1901, whilst the English national team bequeathed Austria and Hungary the honour of being the first nations outside the British Isles that they would play in. Sure enough, bright prospects would shine through the young footballing nation, Imre Schlosser being the first great Hungarian footballer to develop. Schlosser played for both Ferencváros and MTK, the preeminent Hungarian teams of the time. The two clubs would win all 24 league titles between 1903 and 1929. Ferencváros was the everyman's club, and they pitted themselves against MTK with a burgeoning chairman in Alfred Brühl. Brühl was ambitious and had plenty of money to throw around, bestowing the great footballing facilities and stadium onto MTK. This was all part of his master plan to professionalise Hungarian football. He purposely sought out a Scotsman for a new coach, dazzled as he was by the forefathers of the passing game in the early 20th century. Enter Jackie Robertson, the first but by no means the last British export into MTK. Robertson lasted just 1 year, with the persistent onset of war in Europe playing its part in nipping his tenure in the bud. The Great War ensured the postponement of Hungarian football. Brühl's desire to professionalise the sport survived though, and his continued desire to employ a British coach for his club led him to Jimmy Hogan. He was the next British cab off the rank in Budapest. Far from a renowned fitness freak and churchgoer, Hogan was nicknamed the Parson and demanded everything from his players. He embodied the hard-working footballing stereotype of arriving first into training and leaving last. This wasn't his first foray into continental football, however. Hogan was headhunted by the Austrian FA president, Hugo Meisl, whom he worked for until after being interned in a foreigners' camp during the Great War. Desperate for his release and to be reunited with his family, he took up Alfred Brühl's offer to coach at MTK. Supplied with a translator in Dori Kurschner, Hogan reaffirmed the evolution of the vibrant passing game from Scotland to Hungary. Where once the Scottish were the masters of pass and move football, thanks to Hogan's work in Austria and Hungary, the Danubians were now the kings of the passing game. The groundwork had been laid by Hogan, but he wouldn't enjoy a full and illustrious life in Budapest. He hadn't seen his family for 4 years. Austro-Hungary's weakened position in the Great War and subsequent surrender was the respite he needed to return home. Hogan felt his work on the continent was qualification enough to flourish back in his homeland. Instead, he was looked upon with suspicion and had to make do with a job in a tobacco factory in Liverpool, shunned by the FA. He'd soon return to the continent, rejoining the interwar years took its toll on the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Hungarian football in general. Dozens of footballers emigrated to Italy, enforcing professionalisation in Hungary and an eradication of foreign footballers in Italy by the start of the 1930s. Likewise, Dori Kurschner couldn't abide the cruel politics and rampant anti-Semitism, and so emigrated to Switzerland, where he would help bestow the sweeper system to Karl Rappan, who went on to develop the Swiss Bolt tactic. Kurschner welcomed Jimmy Hogan back to continental football with open arms in Switzerland, where the two reconvened at Young Boys of Bern and the national team. Success wasn't too far away, with a silver medal at the 1924 Summer Olympic Games to show for their work. The appetite for Hogan remained in Hungary. Failing to heed Kirschner's warnings about the decline of the nation, Hogan returned to MTK but quickly departed and took up a job working for the German FA. The cruelty of the regime in Hungary didn't stop football flourishing, however, albeit it came more in spite of the regime more than anything else. The vast swathes of anti-Semitism in Hungary led to a band of Jewish immigrants finding their feet in Austria and creating Hakoah Vienna. Hakoah won the Austrian League in their 5th season in existence, spraying the workings of Jimmy Hogan as Kirschner had done earlier in the decade. The quality of their football necessitated a world tour, and soon enough, interest was piqued globally. Some called it the Danubian Whirl, others the Vienna Waltz. Whatever the moniker, Hugo Meisl's Austrian national team left opponents spinning with their incessant 5-pronged forward line interchanging at will. The Wunder team would lose just twice between May 1932 and May 1934, and in the process they became the toast of European football. On this run they dished out an 8-2 batter into Hungary in Vienna on the way to their first World Cup in 1934 in Italy. Both Hungary and Austria would be inextricably linked in their playing style and in their on-pitch reunion. Some lambasted their football as pretty but flimsy and without much substance. The quarter-final of the 1934 World Cup between the pair was anything but. It wasn't flimsy, was crammed full of substance, and unfortunately wasn't much to look at either. The rivalry between the two nations took over as Austria edged the victory 2-1 on the way to being defeated by the hosts in the semi-finals. It was a World Cup won by the obdurate hosts, Italy, as the superlative Central European soccer of both Hungary and Austria, as well as Czechoslovakia, all fell in the wake of the Azzurri. Four years on, in France, Hungary went one better than their Austrian adversaries. The basis for Hungary's improved return on the world stage was a coaching revolution that took place on home soil and abroad. Dori Kurschner had his aforementioned success in Switzerland. Meanwhile, Josef Nagy was coaching the Swedish national team, Josef Eisenhofer lifted the French league title with Marseille, and almost 36 coaches were in the Italian professional league system at any one point during the 1930s. The abstention of key South American names and the continued aloofness from the British FAs left the field for the 1938 World Cup looking weak. Hungary were amongst the favourites alongside holders Italy, host France and Austria. Hungary waltzed into the final, conceding just once and netting 13 in 3 victories over the Dutch East Indies, Switzerland and Sweden in order to meet the holders Italy in Paris. Faced with the holders Italy, perhaps better known as Benito Mussolini's Italy, Hungary pressed the self-destruct button. The 4-2 defeat was sealed long before the teams took to the pitch. Mussolini, in cahoots with fellow fascist and Hungarian leader Miklos Horthy, declared it was for the betterment of fascism that Italy won the tournament. Presumably a Green Horse allegedly colluded with national coach Karol Dietz in order to throw the game. Consequently, 3 of Hungary's best and brightest didn't play: Géza Toldi, Lajos Korani, Vilmos Kahut. The latter even more gallingly, since Dietz had defied the Hungarian FA orders to select Kahut, who plied his trade outside of Hungarian borders, for Marseille. The rumours of the Italian-Hungarian pact spread like wildfire back in Budapest, where fascism was very much on the rise. Dietz was widely labelled a traitor and was forced into resigning weeks after the tournament. Things on and off the pitch for Hungary didn't get much better with the onset of the Second World War. A sacrificial lamb for the Nazi Party, with almost 1 million of the Hungarian Jewish populace transferred to camps, Hungary was said to have been saved during the winter of 1944 and 45 in the Siege of Budapest by the Soviet Union. The transfer of Hungary as a puppet state for one empire to another was at the immediate benefit of football. Gusztav Sebes was of Swabian descent, and his future in football was confirmed from day one, as he was born in the shadow of the Ferencváros Stadium. He had plied his trade as a utility player under Jimmy Hogan at MTK and found his calling in a post-playing career whilst working as an electrician. The Electric Board's team needed a manager, and Sebes would earn his big break with Elektromos before coaching Slentorince and Sestobel during World War II. Upon the fresh Soviet rule as a staunch communist, Sebes fell into the system as the Deputy Minister for Sport and the national team's assistant coach. His promotion would be fast-tracked. Due to injuries sustained during the war, Tibor Galovic was forced into resigning as the national team's manager, and after a brief power struggle with fellow assistants Bela Guttman and Gabor Kleber, Sebes had the job he wanted. His skills were more in management and organisation than it was in coaching. He brought in former MTK teammate Erno Kalmar as his assistant and Gyula Mandi as first-team coach. Sebes relied on his coaches to win the dressing room over whilst organising committees and the structure of A, B and C teams. Winning bronze at the 1948 Olympic Games earned Sebes the trust and, more pertinently, the financial backing from Hungary's new leader, Matyas Rákosi. Changes were afoot. Professionalism swiftly ended. The Hungarian league calendar was aligned with the Soviet one, and the best clubs in Budapest were placed under the ownership of the government. Defence Minister Mihály Farkas gift-wrapped Gusztav Sebes' first choice to find the most suitable club in which to mould to his want, so the national team could be improved. Gusztav Sebes was heavily influenced by the superb Dynamo Moscow team of the 1940s and their Pasovochka football, a stereotypically communist style that relied on the collective as opposed to the individual. Sebes leaned on Dynamo's administration of regimented coaching, prioritising mental and physical health, as well as streamlining their kit and equipment, all facets that Sebes deployed for the Hungarian team. Dynamo Moscow were formed by brothers Clement and Harry Czarnok of Blackburn, hence the traditional blue and white colours akin to their hometown club. Dynamo were motoring along just fine, then their entire history was shaped by 1923's events when the club was transformed by the secret police, who now controlled the club. Come the 30s, Boris Arkadeyev was headhunted to coach the team. He was the one to implement a Pasovochka style of football, which is translated to mean organised disorder. This was a communist dream of the collective all pulling in the correct direction and completely shunning individualistic elements of the sport. Players didn't hold positions, they moved freely to the flow of the game. Off the field, Arkadeyev was a revolutionary as well, prioritising both the mental and physical health of the players. He streamlined all aspects of the players' kit, maintained the players' fitness throughout the long Soviet winters by advising on a curriculum of indoor sports. Once the Second World War was over, Dynamo took to Europe and played some of the best teams England had to offer. Draws were attained against Chelsea and Rangers, whilst 10 goals were put beyond Cardiff, and even Arsenal were bettered 4-3. Their subsequent tour of continental Europe attracted Hungary's defence minister, Mihály Farkas, to the idea of implementing communist ideals to the national team and its clubs. In the inner circle of the Hungarian national team was the nomadic Bela Guttman, who served as one of Tibor Galovic's temporary assistants alongside Gabor Kleber. Guttman's character was never going to allow him to remain in what was ostensibly a tight-knit unit without the final say. Guttman was taught the ways of the Danubian world, yet was diametrically opposed to Gusztav Sebes. Sebes' aim was to create a well-oiled Hungarian machine to be successful over a decade. Guttman's belief was that more than 2 seasons at a club was fatal. A former player of MTK Budapest and Hakoah Vienna, he dipped out of the Austrian team during their world tour to remain in New York. Unfortunately, Guttman's timing was off. The Great Depression hit the United States and football as a sport collapsed in on itself. After sojourns back in Austria and then in the Netherlands, Guttman returned to the States in 1935 with a visa. There was soon an opening though, back in his homeland. Laszlo Sternberg was the coach at Újpest, but the rise of anti-Semitism in Hungary led to his emigration. This opened the door back to Hungary for Bela Guttman, only to fall foul of the same anti-Jewish laws that Sternberg had attempted to escape from. Guttman could be found at Vasas, then in Romania with Cinizul Timișoara before returning to Újpest to win the Hungarian League. His coaching career would balloon to 40 years, and his most famous period came in his longest spell, which spanned into 3 years and warranted 2 European Cups with Benfica. But first he had to escape conscription into a Labour battalion. There, he was reunited with Erno Erbstein. A fairly nondescript midfielder of the early 20th century, Erno Erbstein retired whilst in the Hungarian second flight after a stint in Italy was ended prematurely by newly adopted rules on foreign players. On a tour of the United States with Hakoah Vienna, however, Erbstein's coaching juices began to flow. He found himself intrigued by the different nuances of the WM formation when coping with the new offside law of 1925. His time at Olympia in Italy bore out his love for the Italian game. The entirety of his managerial career would play out in the country thanks to no laws on foreign coaches. Erbstein's early spells at Bari, Nocarina and Cagliari were largely in the second and third tiers, adopting his WM system. His big break came at the ambitious Lucchese, where he took the third-tier outfit to 7th place in the newly formed Serie A. A treble blow, though, would strike Erbstein in 1938. First, he was cursed by his own success, as a plethora of his star players were coaxed away by the richer and more successful clubs. Then a bout of pneumonia left him hospitalised before finally the rise of anti-Semitism was complete with Mussolini's announcement of a legal racial hierarchy in the census of Italy's foreign Jewish population that followed. His dismissal from Lucchese, situated in a deeply fascist area of the country, was a blessing in disguise. Erbstein was turned down for the Lazio job based on his religion before succeeding a compatriot Gyula Feldman at a more liberal Torino. This would be what he would become most famous for. Anti-Semitic legislation prematurely forced him out of the job that December. Erbstein's managerial career, though, would be interrupted further by the Second World War. He returned home to Hungary via a refusal by border guards to enter the Netherlands. With Mussolini out of the picture after the war, Erbstein kept regular contact with Torino's president, Ferruccio Novo. He was granted a return to Turin after the war and his escape from the labour camp with Bela Guttman. Only then did Erbstein receive the widespread acclaim he had deserved for approaching a decade as a football manager. His fluid version of the WM was dependent on what Erbstein termed the quadrilatero of inside forwards Ezio Loic and Valentino Mazzola, as well as wing halves Giuseppe Grezza and Eusebio Castellano. In his first season back, Erbstein increased Torino's Scudetto winning tally from 3 to 10 points. The football his Torino's side played in the late 1940s was far removed from what the WM had become, and was a new age of football that has been compared to the total football of the Dutch in the 1970s. A late season 0-0 draw against Inter Milan had all but secured a 5th successive league title that had earned Il Grande Torino enough respite to play a testimonial in Lisbon. Upon their return, they encountered low clouds, intense rain and poor visibility. A little after 5 p.m. on the early May evening, the plane carrying 31 passengers crashed into the Superga hill on the outskirts of Turin. Erno Erbstein, alongside all his team and everybody on board, perished. Sebes elected to control Honved, formerly Kishpest, which sat on the outskirts of Budapest and had nurtured two of the country's brightest talents, Ferenc Puskas and József Bocsik. Puskas was the original number 10 and, simply put, the greatest player Hungary had ever or likely will ever have. He combined with his lifelong friend Bocsik, a deep-lying playmaker with boundless elegance. Sandor Kocsis was Ferencváros's primarily outlet for goals, until Honved poached him from the club of the right wing. Speaking of the right wing, Kocsis was quickly joined by his lifelong friend and often sister, Laszlo Budai. The pair broke every youth record known to Hungarian football and were soon working their magic for both Honved and the national team. Sebes wedged Honved into the middle of a pay dispute between Zoltan Czibor and Ferencváros. The signing of the exciting winger quickly followed. Then he pressured the regime into another addition, Jules Laurent in from prison, a centre-half with a university degree. Laurent repaid his manager by being his most loyal on-field servant. Another Jules, Kocsis, was punished with army conscription, and soon enough the best goalkeeper in the land would join the army's team, Honved, of course. Sebes had created a Frankenstein's monster of a club team and, as planned, it was of direct benefit to the national team. After a 5-2 defeat to Czechoslovakia in Prague in April 1949, the tactical revolution finally took place under Sebes. The subsequent year was traversed undefeated. Erno Erbstein was drafted in at right back after his predecessor Ferenc Rudas's career was curtailed by a leg break. Erbstein, the only player not to ply his trade in the capital, was joined in a three-man backline by Julia Lantos and Mihail Lantos. A three-man backline until Hungary's fluidity kicked in. The deployment of Joseph Zacharias at left half often created a four-man defence, with the more adventurous right half in József Bocsik flooding forward. Football in the 1940s and 50s was often underscored with the perpetual unrelenting tactics of the WM formation. By the Olympic Games in Helsinki, Hungary would change all of that. But first, tactical innovation was needed. Gusztav Sebes therefore relied on Marton Bukovi. The former Hungarian international centre-half won everything there was to win whilst at Ferencváros, including 4 league championships, 3 domestic cups and a Mitropa Cup. Reflecting on his playing career, Bukovi lamented, "I made up systems, asked coaches, wanted to know. I thought about the ways of training, often unsatisfied with the practices we had. I felt we needed to work more, with more of a plan." It appeared only a matter of time before Bukovi would take to the touchline. After rejecting an approach from MTK Budapest, Bukovi moved to Yugoslavia for a decade, where he coached Gdańsk Zagreb. His success saw a couple of league titles before the onset of the Second World War. In this time, Bukovi leaned on the Italian Sistema, but after a tour of England went to type by deploying the WM thanks to its direct nature. Although he was suspicious of the formation, predicting forthcoming trends, stating, "I believe that a new system will emerge after the war. Systems change and have to change." When the war relented and Tito delivered his own brand of communism to Yugoslavia, all football clubs were stripped of their previous identity. Gdańsk therefore would become Dynamo Zagreb. Bukovi remained installed as manager. A Zagreb championship match against Lokomotiva was the scene of Bukovi's experimentation of what we would term a false nine. Dragutin Ripko, a fairly lumbering and not very technical forward, was the man designated to this role. Bukovi labelled him his lab rat against Lokomotiva. Withdrawn forward experiments had stretched only as far as Corinthians' Gio Smith in the 19th century, Independiente's Luis Rafficino in the 20s, and Austria's Matthias Sindelar of the 30s. However, none had gone to the lengths to withdraw their forward so deep that he was effectively a midfielder. With Brazilian experimentations of a back four in the works, the new prevailing system of its time, the 4-2-4, was alive and well. Soon after the war, Bukovi moved back to Budapest, where he coached MTK. After the sale of Norbert Höfling to Lazio in 1949, the manager stumbled upon the perfect player for the withdrawn forward role, Nandor Hidegkuti. Bukovi revolutionised Hungarian football coaching, succeeding Gusztav Sebes as the president of the Trainer Society in 1948. Under his spell, player registration ballooned from 15,000 to 100,000, and an unprecedented 900 coaches were created. By all accounts, he made his sessions fun, but short. His legacy was obvious. Written in his obituary was perhaps the most pertinent quote. It stated, "I don't believe Hungarian football has ever had such a profoundly accomplished expert." By 1950, Hungary had coaches, players, the facilities at their disposal, and now they had a style of play too. Initially a right winger, Nandor Hidegkuti was a nomad in terms of the Hungarian national team, and he never signed for Honved. By the Olympic Games of 1952, in which Hungary were amongst the favourites, Hidegkuti's role changed dramatically. Aping Marton Bukovi, Sebes deployed Hidegkuti as the false nine, the main facet of their title procession in 1951. He would drop into midfield, leaving his defensive counterparts confused. Should they stay and allow their opponent the freedom of the playing field, or should they follow them and subsequently open up the final third for opponents to attack? Hungary, after all, weren't short of attacking talents. Zoltan Czibor would flip from wing to wing, Laszlo Budaj would provide devastating crosses for Sandor Kocsis, the out-and-out goalscorer, and Ferenc Puskas played off his teammate to incredible effect. The lack of professionalism in the Eastern Bloc, combined with the Olympics only permitting amateur players since the 1920s, allowed for the likes of Hungary, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union to be frontrunners for the trophy. Hungary's rhythm appeared to be off in a preliminary victory over Romania, but soon came to the fore when the proper tournament began. Italy were humiliated 3-0 in the last 16, Turkey 7-1 in the quarter-finals, and the Olympic champions Sweden were battered 6-0. Yugoslavia awaited in the final, the reigning silver medalists, and an opponent that the Soviet Union needed beaten. Yugoslavia were run by Tito, a communist, but a communist who wished to extol Yugoslavian communism, not that of the Soviet Union. Also, they had eliminated the Soviets from the first round. Ferenc Puskas missed a penalty, Sandor Kocsis had 2 goals disallowed before finally the deadlock was broken. Puskas with the opener before Zoltan Czibor sealed gold with a long-range strike. Hungary's performance had the ears of Europe pricked up, none more so than FIFA and the FA chief, Stanley Rouse. The Magical Magyars, therefore, were headed to England. November 1953 came quickly after the Olympics. Giuseppe Meazza warned Hungary and Gusztav Sebes that their Olympic team was tainted by the fact that the Magyars had defeated an amateur Italian team. Of course, Hungary eviscerated Italy again, 3-0 again, but this time in Rome. Sweden, Czechoslovakia and Austria were all vanquished before Hungary pitched up at Wembley. Both of England and Hungary's final games prior to the game, subsequently known as the match of the century, should have been an eye-opener for both teams. England rescued a draw against the rest of the World 11, whilst Hungary inaugurated their new NEP Stadion with a 2-2 draw against Sweden, who were managed by Englishman George Rayner. Rayner identified the threat of Nandor Hidegkuti and nullified it by dropping his defence incredibly deep to kill off any threat of runners beyond the false nine. With the blueprint edged under the nose of Walter Winterbottom and his England team led by Billy Wright, Stanley Matthews and Tom Finney, the Three Lions were confident of victory. Even Britain's communist newspaper, The Daily Worker, predicted a comfortable England win. Not overawed by being the first visitors from behind the Iron Curtain to visit the home of football, Hungary took the lead within 45 seconds, Nandor Hidegkuti scoring the goal. Despite this early strike, Gusztav Sebes instructed his chargers to be cautious in the opening 15 minutes. In fact, Hidegkuti was deployed more advanced than usual, just so the Hungarians could get to grip with England. On commentary, Kenneth Wolstenholme had to carefully describe Hungary's numbering system. If the English audience were confused by the numbering system of the Magyars, then Hidegkuti's withdrawn positioning had the England players utterly bamboozled. Jackie Sewell levelled the scores up on the 13th minute before Sebes reverted Hungary to their fluid 4-2-4 and Hidegkuti restored his nation's lead 7 minutes later. Then the moment the match is most known for, when Ferenc Puskas barrelled towards the byline, only to drag the ball back with his studs and thrash the ball into the net. Geoffrey Green of The Times described the unwitting defender Billy Wright as a fire engine going to the wrong fire, humiliated as he had been by Puskas. England limped into the half-time break 4-2 down. Harry Johnston, the centre-back which Nandor Hidegkuti had sufficiently confused, sought clarity on his instruction for the second half. Regardless, the second period went very much the same way as the first, Hungary totting up their fifth and sixth goals within 8 minutes of the second half. They eased off. England were grateful for losing just 6-3. Would England learn from this humiliation? Stanley Rouse declared an off day by his nation's players and so arranged a Budapest rematch in May, mere weeks before the 1954 FIFA World Cup. 7-1, it was Hungary's finest display. Sid Owen, Harry Johnston's replacement at centre-half, didn't fare much better against Nandor Hidegkuti, and Hungary ran away with the game thanks to a stunning second-half display from Zoltan Czibor. They called it the disaster on the Danube. Hungary were now installed as big favourites to win the 1954 FIFA World Cup. "6-4 were the odds, and Hungary travelled to Switzerland without having to lift a finger in qualification, literally, as their opponents Poland withdrew. Regardless, Hungary was seeded, and thanks to their peculiarities of the 1954 FIFA World Cup, would only play South Korea and West Germany in a 4-team group. Their opener was a mere formality, as Hungary didn't have to move through the gears against South Korea to score 9 without reply. Next, it was the unknown quantity of West Germany. Since the Second World War, they had been enshrouded in secrecy, with no team wishing to host them in a football match and with their disqualification for the 1950 tournament. Their manager was Sepp Herberger, and he had several tricks up his sleeve. First, off the back of a 7-2 victory over Turkey in a guaranteed playoff in order to qualify for the knockouts, 8 of West Germany's first team were rested for the challenge of Hungary. Therefore, the 8-3 defeat they incurred didn't matter too much. Secondly, Werner Liebrich kicked Ferenc Puskas out of the game, with fears that Hungary's greatest ever player would miss the rest of the tournament. Brian Glanville labelled it the foul that won the World Cup. Puskas would play again that summer, but it wouldn't be until the final. Before then, the world was treated to both the best and the worst of Hungary. The worst was showcased in the quarter-final, but only for their non-footballing antics in what was subsequently captioned the Battle of Bern against Brazil. Hungary surged into a 2-goal lead inside 7 minutes against the Seleção. Michal Lantos grabbed the Magyars' third before Sandor Kocsis added a fourth to seal victory. Those were not the headlines from the Swiss capital, however. The headlines were from the elbowing, tripping and stomping that was initiated by the Brazilians, by the horrific defensive tackles from Jeno Buzanski and Julia Laurent for Hungary before Brandauzinho ended Joseph Tott's World Cup, and Nilton Santos and Joseph Boxics were sent off for trading punches. With the match won, the spectacle did not end there. Zoltan Czibor was gut-punched after a handshake prank gone wrong with Marinho, and Brazil's coach Zezé Moreira was spat on. His counterpart, Gusztav Sebes, didn't get off scot-free either, requiring stitches after a boot to the face. Ferenc Puskas smashed a bottle over the head of the Brazilian opponent Pinheiro in the dressing room area, and finally, only then, could Hungary celebrate their place in a World Cup semi-final. The semi-final against Uruguay, the reigning world champions who had yet to be defeated in the World Cup thanks to their abstentions in the 1934 and 38 tournaments. It was a semi-final which allowed the beauty of Hungary to shine through. Whilst their prior encounter was named after a battle, the semi-final was simply labelled the Game of the Century and is often housed alongside other World Cup classics such as Italy's win over Brazil in 1982, as well as Italy's victory against West Germany in 1970. Hungary started both halves as quick as they started the first against Brazil, thanks to Zoltan Czibor's deflected opener and Nandor Hidegkuti's diving header to run up a 2-goal lead. Where that pertained to Hungary's vastly superior fitness and warm-up regimes, the Magyars wilted deep into the second half. Juan Eduardo Hoberg netted twice in the final 15 minutes to force extra time. In their additional time, Hungary proved their character after both teams had chances cleared off the line. Their breakthrough goal in extra time came from a well-worn method, Laszlo Budaj combining with goalscorer Sandor Kocsis. Kocsis was then benefited from a bout of Uruguayan defensive cramp to add a fourth and book Hungary's place in the World Cup final. The Wankdorf Stadium in Bern was a quagmire, sodden as to benefit a more brutish West German game and to hamper Hungary's fluid football. Any fears of the type of football Hungary could play was tempered by the news that Ferenc Puskas was given the all-clear to return from his ankle injury. In the camp, however, there were reservations from the players. Laszlo Budaj, despite his assist and generally positive semi-final performance, was dropped for the final. Zoltan Czibor swapped wings in favour of Michail Tot to play left wing. Of Tot, Czibor remarked, he wasn't in any way an international footballer. West Germany's preparations were serene, be it their comparatively comfortable 6-1 semi-final win over Austria, or their tranquil camp that soothed their month-long stay in Switzerland. Irrespective of their contrasting preparations and the condition of the pitch, Hungary flew out of the blocks through Ferenc Puskas and Zoltan Czibor inside 8 minutes. It flattered Hungary's middling start to the game, however, as West Germany roared back level thanks to Max Morlock and Helmut Rahn before we'd even had 20 minutes. Soon the flow of the game reverted back to Hungary. This was despite Adidas supplying West Germany with studs more suitable to the turf, and this was despite the boggy pitch which sedated Hungary's passing. Tony Turek in the West German net had the game of his life. He first denied Nandor Hidegkuti with the scores level and produced one last save from Zoltan Czibor to stop extra time. Hungary were incredibly unfortunate not to get their paws on the Jules Rimet trophy. First they hit the woodwork twice and had a number of chances cleared off the line. And that's before we mention the fact that Ferenc Puskas stuck the ball in the net with 2 minutes remaining. The referee, Bill Ling, returned to the centre circle to restart the game at 3 goals apiece, and there was little by way of West German remonstrations, until Welsh assistant Mervyn Griffiths' flag was lifted into the air, with the indication that the goal should not stand. It didn't, and Hungary wouldn't come as close to winning the World Cup ever again. The blame game started instantly. First to feel the Hungarian wrath were the officials for what was deemed an incorrect decision to rule out Ferenc Puskas' late leveller. Then the Hungarian attention turned to the West Germans, who openly admitted to injecting themselves with what they called vitamins, but is widely assumed to have been performance-enhancing drugs. Morally incorrect, of course, but by the laws of the game in 1954, this was all above board. Then Hungary turned on themselves. Gusztav Sebes was blamed for including a subpar performer in Michail Tot, for his exclusion from the national team of Karol Sandor and Frank Souza, and for not appointing a direct replacement for Puskas. Even though Puskas bore some brunt, deemed selfish for returning to the squad too soon and without gaining full fitness. Rumours swirled from the Hungarian team placated with Mercedes, as well as anti-communist conspiracies by both FIFA and the referees. Either way, the protest burned brightly and briefly, yet had a lasting impact on the entire nation. The train station where the team was supposed to return home to was decorated in Hungarian flags, which were quickly removed before the protest grew in number and raged on. The authorities struggled to contain the rebels. The frustration of a decade of Soviet rule just about stopped. Neither side, however, would forget how close everything came to collapsing. Gyula Grossis, goalkeeper of the Magical Magyars, noted that in those demonstrations lay the seeds of the 1956 uprising. Before football was curtailed in Hungary, the nation remained somewhat optimistic ahead of the 1958 World Cup in Sweden. After all, calmer heads prevailed and admitted that Hungary were probably just frightfully unlucky in 1954, and the likes of Puskas, Grossis, Kocsis and Czibor would all be in their pomp for the following World Cup. European club football was affording the Honved team, as one of the frontrunners in the continent, marvellous opportunities to test themselves out against the best Europe had to offer in precursor games to the European Cup. Friendlies against West Brom and Wolves, as well as Red Star Belgrade, enhanced Honved's reputation and gave them invaluable experience. However, the walls came crumbling down long before the revolution. Czibor was dropped for disciplinary reasons, something the winger learned off through the media. Grossis was indefinitely banned for smuggling in hairpins. Meanwhile, Zacharias wouldn't play for the national team after the 1954 final, after betraying Sebes' trust and breaking his curfew in Bern before the final. The transition of power from Stalin to Khrushchev in Moscow did little to stabilise matters in Hungary either, as the October 1956 revolution was prompted by 5,000 students that demanded the removal of the Soviets from Hungary. Less than a fortnight later, Soviet tanks would rumble through Budapest and several key players would never play professionally in Hungary ever again. Promises of global tours, rebel leagues and defections fell away for the majority returning to their homeland. But for the likes of Zoltan Czibor, Sandor Kocsis and Ferenc Puskas, they would stay clear. All three's post-Hungarian careers highlighted by their participation in El Clasico for Real Madrid and Barcelona throughout the 1950s and 60s. Hungary would go out in the group stages of the 1958 FIFA World Cup, and whilst qualifying for the knockout stages in the subsequent two tournaments, failed to light up a tournament like they had done when they were magical. Hungarian football just about influenced every winner of the FIFA World Cup, perhaps with the exception of Uruguay's inaugural win in 1930. Italy's double success of the 1930s owed a large part to the coaching instilled at Inter Milan and beyond by the Hungarian trio of Arpad Weiss, István Tóth and Erno Erbstein. Had the Superga air disaster not happened, it is likely we could be talking about an Italian side enormously influenced and populated by Erbstein's Torino players that won 3 World Cup titles in a row. South America was influenced thanks to the teachings of Imre Herschel, directly leading to Uruguay's 1950 triumph over Brazil, as well as the Seleção's own successors of 1958 and 1962. West Germany's world champions of 1954 had the rivals of coaches Dori Kurschner and Alfred Schäfer to thank tactically. Meanwhile, Josef Eisenhofer and Bela Guttman prompted footballing developments in France and Portugal respectively. Even Alf Ramsey, a player humiliated by Hungary in 1953, helped shape England away from the WM and into their back four glory that is so fondly remembered from 1966. The total football of Rinus Michels and the Dutch throughout the 1970s was sparked by Hungarian coaches. That leads us through the lineage of Johan Cruyff, Pep Guardiola and La Masia at Barcelona. Valery Lobanovsky and his Dynamo Kiev team borrowed from Hungary too, and they have birthed a different lineage via Ralf Rangnick and into modern-day coaches Thomas Tuchel and Julian Nagelsmann. Lobanovsky's contemporary Arrigo Sacchi also, and he has had directly influenced the work of Jurgen Klopp. Therefore, even in 2023, the main proponents of elite-level football have their roots in Hungary.